Welcome to What in the World, a project initiated by Hungry for Life International. Today's podcast is titled Using Attachment Theory to Do No Harm, and Abby will be interviewing Aisling Zweigle. So grab your headphones, sit back, relax, and listen as we hear about her expertise on the issue of attachment to children during short-term teams.
Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of What in the World, the podcast where we talk about all things to do with running a global nonprofit. And so today we're really excited because we have a special guest on today over FaceTime, over Zoom. We have Aisling here, and she is a family pastor at 10th Church in Vancouver. And so we're really excited to have her on. Welcome, Aisling.
Great to be with you. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. And we actually got to know Aisling through Hungry for Life's partnership with 10th and a few different projects. And she was actually able to go on a trip to Cambodia this past November with Hungry for Life. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, it was so meaningful. Really excellent partnership to have somebody who is very special from your team with us. And just build on partnerships that 10th Church already has there that have a lot of life and longevity to them. And getting a chance to really fan the flame of some great leaders while we were there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So through actually this podcast came about because I was having a conversation with the team leader on that team, Elise, and she was saying how, being a part of missions and going on trips like that, you often have situations where you're interacting with people of all ages, and so that's kind of the topic of today's podcast is children and attachment and how they bond and attach to their adults and caregivers, and so we're really excited to have you on. Aisling is well educated in early childhood development, attachment, and how to care for children through often traumatic experiences. And so, I'll let you share a little bit about that and your background and what it's looked like for you to study those things.
Yeah, I would like to first say that when people hear a topic relates to kids, it can be very tempting for people to say, oh, kids aren't my thing. And then I like to say to a room full of people, how many of you entered into the world and skipped being a child? Raise your hand. And so by that, I like to just remind everyone that a child's journey is our journey. And what I have learned about attachment and trauma-informed care is important for all of us.
Thanks for sharing that.
And I actually have my undergrad degree in psychology. Really early on, knew that I felt called to work with children at risk who had experienced hard things and been in hard spaces. My next degree was in it was a religious education degree, but with an emphasis on cross-cultural ministry and also on holistic child development with a focus on our global work and advocacy for kids and young people. And I also am certified in early childhood ed, and I have been in ministry in a few different countries and gotten to take what I've learned and put it into practice in some really unique places.
Yeah, and I got the privilege of looking into a bit of your research that you did in the Philippines, and share a little bit about that and what that looked like.
Yeah. Part of the reason that I went to the Philippines, I had worked with children and youth and families from all over the world when my husband and I were both in ministry in Seattle and then in Vancouver, British Columbia. We're dual citizens and have worked on both sides of the border, and then had the opportunity to continue my training as a pastor, but to do it while being paired up with mentors in ministry and in child advocacy in Manila. And I was a part of a program that gave me time to learn and serve in child development centers, to be able to preach and teach myself, but also to do some original research in an orphanage just outside of Manila.
Okay.
And yeah, hoping I get a chance to talk about some of the things I learned while I was there.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so you've touched on this a little bit, but just share a little bit about what made you want to originally go into, like you said, as you're studying psychology, you had a specific interest in children at risk. Talk about like your heart and what made you want to go into this particular area of study.
Yeah. Well, as often is the case, it connects with the very meaningful healing that I experienced in my own life. I went through some hard things in my childhood, and the church really came around me and my twin sister, my family, when we were in a time of crisis, had experienced some abuse. And I was in foster care for just a few days while they made sure my mom was a safe person, that we had a network of support. And I have always felt like I just barely peeked in to some really dark places, and that my life's calling was to be a part of seeing healing take place in the lives of those who were still in dark places. So it's a very direct call in my own life. And then I think we all have places where we just feel like our gifts and our sweet spot, where we get to use our interests. And for me, I've heard it referred to like when someone plays a chord on the piano, and if you lift the lid, you can see the strings really resonating. And when I heard about some of the child development work happening in that part of the world, and how close people could be to some of that holistic child development work, it was like the chord was being played, and I just felt like I was supposed to have a really up close look. And I wanted to go not as someone doing something. I wanted to go as somebody who was a guest and a learner. So the chance that I had to really observe, do research, have my own theory come out of my observations and research was just really rich. And it's changed my life and the things that I touch and give myself to now.
That's so cool. Yeah, every person is designed for a different thing, and God created us all so uniquely. And it's so cool when we get to experience that, where it's like kind of that sweet spot where we feel like some of our top skills, our interests, and the things that we were designed to do are just needed in the space that we're at. And so we're able to cultivate that and see growth in ourselves, but then also in the communities and the places that we're investing in. So that's really cool.
I'd like to add to that real quick. Something I love to say to people who feel like they're on that journey of discovering how they're wired or what they feel called to give themselves to. I always say, God doesn't waste anything. He weaves it back in. And one of my favorite stories leading up to going away to do that work was that I was doing a lot of work reading about cross-cultural ministry, about child development, about trauma-informed care. I had a background in some of the arts, ways that people used art therapy, music therapy, global development work. And every morning I would come to my morning coffee with my husband, and I would talk about something else I was passionate about. And my husband, who's very calm and measured and focused, would drink his coffee and say, "Yeah, Ash, you should do that." And then I would come back the next day with this other, but maybe God's really calling me to do this. And he'd say, "Yeah, Ash, you should do that." And then finally one day he just looked at me and said, "No, Ash, I mean it. Just pick something and do it." So my joke is that when I finished my 250 pages of my thesis, and in it included, and we'll probably get to that, included some of children's artwork. It included all kinds of, trauma-informed principles and global awareness of orphans and vulnerable children, all these things weaved in. And I remember just holding it in front of my husband, and I said, "There, That's what I was talking about.
Yeah.
That's what God was asking me to do.
Hmm.
I sounded crazy at the time, but it made sense.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. And so, on the topic of some of the research that you were doing, for people that might be listening that don't know the word
Yes.
attachment or don't have any sort of
Yes.
mental framework for what that means, maybe just
Yes.
explain what that is.
Hmm. So, um, some of the initial research that would be like seminal research, people who would be well known for attachment theory would be John Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth, Mary Main, and those people were really looking at what they were learning about children who were taken away from their caregivers or their parents, their moms during war, during times of significant illness or crisis. And what they started to see was the behavior that followed actually had some patterns, and those patterns are really important to how we are wired
Yeah.
to connect and attach. And what they called it was I'll just say this really quickly, was a circle of security. And this, you can imagine it when you think of a child who comes into a room holding onto their mom's hand, and then what happens when some stranger walks in the room and that significant caregiver leaves the child in the room and the child's feeling anxious. And we can see these patterns where the child may call out in distress. They initiate the connection and being secured again to that person that they count on for their everything. And then to watch the pattern of what happens when a caregiver is reunited and a child is really meaningfully connected, and the parent and the child are attuned to one another, that they have what they would have this bit of repair and they reconnect and all is well. They have a safe haven, and it gives them the courage to explore again and try things, get anxious, reconnect, fueled up. And we call this the circle of security.
Okay.
Well, what we see in children who go through crisis is that there are times where that repair doesn't happen.
Okay.
And so some of those theorists and researchers have been able, through different very significant studies, to be able to see, oh, there's different types of attachment. For instance, there's times where there's disorganized attachment or avoidant attachment, and then we need to look at what tools can help those children to get the security they need, or to even help the parents to be able to meaningfully give the child what they need. And then we look at all kinds of at-risk behaviors when you've got demographics of people who've experienced poverty, who don't have the resources they need. Yeah. Maybe there's a deceased parent or a crisis that separates them. And so in the orphanage I was in, I was able to learn some things that I believe are not only building on what other researchers have explored, it actually expands it, because I really learned about the way that this Filipino context had some special things to teach us that were different than maybe what some of our Western understandings of attachment often include.
Yeah, that's really exciting to be able to be a part of new research and expanding an area of research and education and psychology that is so foundational for every person, and for every person that deals with children specifically. And so, as you understand it, what are some of the impacts of a child not having that proper attachment?
So what's really meaningful is the kind of new bits of research that are taking it from just understanding attachment as kind of behavior, healthy behavior, maladaptive behavior, and actually looking at how it relates so much to a child or a person's ability to regulate regulate their sense of anxiety, of stress, of arousal, and to see how a parent who is able to mirror what the child is needing, is giving a cue for matching behavior, that when that happens in the way that we are designed to have it happen, that the brain actually is being lit up, is actually growing and developing in response to that relationship.
Okay, yeah.
And oftentimes what we find is that children who don't get those connections, those layers of relationship, of matched attunement, of attachment repair, they can often struggle with sequential reasoning, with all kinds of things that the frontal lobe of the brain help you to do. It's like a traffic control system.
Okay, yeah.
Being able to connect the dots between action and reaction, to be able to empathically connect with other people, and be able to problem solve, to be able to self-soothe, and even respond and follow other people's cues. You can see how all of those things would impact a child, and this is where I say all of us,
Yeah.
all human beings,
Yeah.
on how we handle stress, how we're able to maintain relationship, how we are able to build trust and adapt to change, to self-regulate, to calm. Yeah, huge impacts. And what I learned in my research was that some of those needs can be addressed even in a residential care setting that is being intentionally sensitive to those attachment needs.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I think when some people think about how children attach to their caregivers, they think that can only really happen in a healthy way if they're with their parents, both of their parents.
Yes.
But yeah, it's an interesting perspective for you, having done research in an orphanage.
Yes.
And an orphanage where, there's consistent care and people that are intentionally trying to care for the children in a trauma-informed way.
Yes.
That those attachments can actually happen,
Yes.
even though there is a lack of, the parents, the direct parents in the kids' lives.
Yeah, exactly. And what was really striking to me was I visited one orphanage that was not attentive to those needs
Okay,
or
yeah.
best practices. And they made a point of saying to me, we really try to not build too strong a relationship with the kids because we don't want to make it harder for them when they're adopted and they have to leave. And as part of my writing, and as I really was doing my reading and all of my data collecting, I remembered writing, an attachment that is not worth grieving was not attachment at all.
Yeah.
And that those attachments are the very building blocks for us to be able to do it again and build relationship with others. So I chose the orphanage I was in because I learned that the director was this, what I call almost a lioness. She was so fiercely passionate about being a safeguard for kids of all ages with hard stories. And when visitors would come, she would not only make sure that the children always stayed with a particular caregiver that she called like a mama. She would also actually say to visitors in a way that was slightly socially awkward for Westerners, don't even think about touching my children. And what she was doing was letting, especially with like short-term visitors who would come in and make their rotation, she was letting them know, hey, just like going into a home that's got another set of parents or family members, you don't get to sweep in and touch my kids. Like this, we have healthy practices that are teaching these kids about what it means to be to have healthy boundaries and healthy attachment.
Yeah.
And when I first heard her say that, I knew that's where I was going to be doing my research.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really cool perspective because yeah, it's there. I think a lot of people would have that similar mindset of like you don't want to make it harder for the kids when you leave, or um, kind of almost like show them what they're missing when it could be
Yeah.
kind of a that kind of a relationship that they should be having with their biological parents. But if that's not the case, some
Yeah.
people might, kind of lean back. And so, yeah, it's really interesting to hear a bit of a window into what your research looked like. Your thesis is called An Exploration of Relationships and Potential for Growth of Love.
Mhm.
So, talk a little bit about some of the core questions that you asked in that research.
Yeah, I was really using a grounded theory method, and grounded theory really asks that the researcher come in and not have a set hypothesis,
Mm,
that you come in really open to the data or the things you're going to see and discover,
mm,
and that the best instrument you have is actually yourself, the
mm.
researcher.
Yeah.
And so rather than coming in with a predetermined idea of what I was looking for, I was really wanting to stay initially very open and just ask, what is the nature of relationships in this place? What is the nature of relationships between the children and the caregivers?
Yeah.
And then actually opening my eyes, wait, there's 120 children here, and there's cooks, and there's caregivers, and there's social workers, there's teachers, there's drivers. And it was just this sense of openness. Who is surrounding me in this space? And what are their relationships with the kids? I was wanting to learn about the whole environment. And so I started very open-handed. I was going back and forth to, when I would ask more questions, I would go
Mm-hmm.
back to do more reading, go to other maybe Tagalog speaking Filipinos and learn from them, ask them questions. I was really being the student.
Mm.
And then out of that, I started the process of different phases of coding where you start finding patterns.
Yeah.
And then you start having um, these emerging theory that's kind of rising to the surface. And that's when I ended up with my theory called what I call ONA,
Okay.
orbital network of what attachment.
Yes. Yeah.
And yeah, and really seeing that there was a whole network of nurture, a whole context of relationship, interconnected, these interlocking circles of circles
Mm.
around these children with hard stories, that was providing an environment of care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting perspective because you did come in with a very open-ended question of just like, let's learn, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so then you're able to kind of just observe with fresh eyes and not just like fit your observations into an existing research, but really see like, okay, this isn't just children aren't limited to children, and like how they attach isn't just limited to the one direct main caregiver, but they are impacted by a community, and
Yeah.
I might even go as far as to say that that's maybe a little bit of the Western perspective coming through, because we don't do as well at the whole community living thing as some other cultures do, and so I'm sure it was probably very interesting for you to go into that context and see, okay, it's not just like we isolated our family unit and then we don't, bring other people into our context to love and to care for our children. But in that context, there really is a village, a community that's investing in the children.
Yeah. Yeah. I simply don't have time to tell you
Yeah,
everything I
I'm
learned,
sure. I'm sure.
but it was so meaningful. I had things like what I called the matriarch principle,
Mm,
where I could see the way that the director had such a meaningful, deep, um, impactful relationship with so many of the orphans and young people, and even those who worked for her on the staff. And what I saw was um, I would ask some of the kids and the youth, and even the caregivers and staff members, and I had a translator to make sure it wasn't that it was being spoken in English and Tagalog, but I would say, where is love in this place?
Mm.
Where is love in this place? And the growth of love is a very, people who've studied attachment, that's a very understood phrase to connect with that theory.
Okay.
So it's specific to the research in the past.
Okay.
But I would see some of the children reach for some of the crayons or the pencil crayons or markers I had set out. And every time they would reach for the orange pencil crayon,
Okay.
I would get actual like goosebumps because the director of the orphanage had red hair. And when I would say, where is love in this place? They would put their hands through the color options and they'd pull out the one that represented her hair, and they would start to draw that portrait. And certainly there were other things, patterns, trends that showed up in the artwork, but that was one of the things I started to code. How many times did I see that happen? And what does that tell me about the impact one fiercely committed adult who cares about the well-being of vulnerable children, one adult who can change the whole course of these young people's lives, because she cares enough to change the environment, to model it for other people, and to build meaningful relationship with kids herself. And so out of that, I had kind of these three tiered things I was looking at. Places where when I talk about orbits, there were the whole atmosphere, kind of using a bit of a spacey metaphor, the whole atmosphere that included like routines and meals and policies and safety principles. And then the wavelengths is what I referred to as being the impact that one caregiver could have on a younger caregiver as they modeled it and showed them how to do healthy relationship, how to care for a child who'd gotten hurt or needed to be showed compassion. And then what I called the orbits, and that was that tight link between one child or youth and the adult in the room that they watched for, the one that they could trust in to secure them, to root them, and what the director would often call to bring them back online.
Okay.
And that idea of bringing a child into a healthy, safe, secure relationship and bring them back online.
Yeah, and then when they're online, they're connected to that adult and they feel safe, so that they can then express who they are and learn and try new things and fail and just learn that way, be creative. So some of the reasons that we wanted to have you on the podcast today was because Hungry for Life sends a lot of short-term teams to lots of places all over the world. And some of those teams, not all of them, but some of those teams we will help, build schools or help build orphanages. And so we'll be interacting with children. And so there's just a lot of room to understand best practice in that kind of a ministry. And so we wanted to bring you on just to shed some light on that idea. And so what would you say to, if someone had the opinion, or what would you say to someone who would say that on some of these kinds of short-term teams that you really shouldn't spend much time interacting with children at all, and you should just kind of avoid interacting with them?
I really feel like I learned some things in the role of researcher that I would never have learned otherwise. I'm a very social, extroverted person. And I'm used to coming in the room. And if there's kids, man, I'm on their level and I'm
Mm.
like engaging them, whether I have the language or not. What was interesting was that whole time that I was researcher, I needed to keep thinking, I can't change what's happening in the room. So I need to hold that back a bit,
Mm-hmm.
be a caring, safe, non-anxious presence. Like I
Mm.
still can have a good affect on my face,
Yeah.
smiling, thoughtful. I don't need to be an unsafe person,
Yeah.
or scary, intimidating person. So the kids, some of them learned my name. I would sit close to them while they played, but I also didn't get to be the hero. I
Mm.
didn't get to be the one who was changing the whole story. I was a guest
Mm.
and I was there to learn first. And I think that will change the way I do ministry for the rest of my life,
Mm.
because so much of the time we're so busy doing
Mm-hmm.
that we are less watchful,
Mm.
we're less teachable, and we're not paying attention to where God's already at work. And so
Yeah.
in the lives of children, it means, yeah, a little bit like the director saying, "Don't touch my kids." We can remember our place a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to be there forever.
Mm-hmm.
We're being welcomed in for a while.
Mm-hmm.
We can be caring and attuned and thoughtful. We're not the hero.
Mm-hmm.
We can pay close attention to what God's doing, um, and and then be prayerful about what would it mean for us to have maybe some more long-term engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we would do a little bit more relationship building, maybe empowering the other leaders who are
Mm-hmm.
building the relationship with those kids. It just changes our position in the whole equation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like how you started that as well. Just like a lot of it's about perspective, and
Mm-hmm.
walking into a school or an orphanage, and seeing that in kind of a similar light as like walking into someone's house. Like this is the place where these
Yes.
children, these children's safe place. And
Yes.
so if we were, you know, walking into someone's house here, we wouldn't just immediately go and grab the stuff and kind of be as hands-on, right? And so just understanding the role that like physical space has in a child's life of like,
Mm-hmm.
this is my safe place.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I like how you presented that of just like a lot of it's about perspective.
Yes.
Um,
And I would add to that, you know, sometimes we overestimate the things we see and understand when we
mm,
show up on the scene. And as I did a lot of reading and writing and reflecting on culture, on what like uh, sociologists will call emic versus etic viewpoints. And emic is someone who like is that's your emic viewpoint is what you can see in your own context, but
okay.
the etic viewpoint is like what you're looking at from the outside in. And I've compared it to being on short-term mission, like you're standing in a stadium with all the lights out
Mm,
and your eyes haven't adjusted to the dark yet,
mm.
and you don't even know you're in a stadium. Like you think you're in a small room,
Mm,
but as your eyes adjust, you start to see how far it goes out and how much farther and how much farther. And honestly, doing ministry overseas is a little bit like that, because we're in these new contexts and there's things our eyes haven't adjusted to yet. So I would just say that in our relationship with children, in other cultures and contexts, if we swoop in and do things and act away as if it's our home, our context, there's a lot of things we're just not even seeing yet. We got to give our eyes time to adjust to the space and then really be teachable.
hmm. Yeah, really take the lead from the local leaders and the people that are
Yes.
there already that have
Yes.
existing relationships with these children and have a
Yes.
place of honor in the community, and observe them, and ask them
Yes.
questions of what's
Right.
appropriate and what's not and what would be appreciated and what wouldn't. Yeah,
Exactly.
remaining teachable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Um, So as you've begun to, as you are kind of on the journey of continuing to study and to learn about children and their attachments, what are some of the factors that come together to produce an environment where a child can attach well to a caregiver?
Yeah. Well, as there's that focus on not only the close caregiver or a trusted adult in their world, as we focus on how it relates to brain and body regulation, and learn a lot from new research coming out. I think that creating, well, it really comes right back to that thing of being a learner and paying good attention to the cues. I've often looked at how we might have an idea of what caring is, and we could make it like a smile or laughter or playfulness. But now if we suddenly say a child has fallen and they're bleeding, they need care, well, suddenly laughter and smiling, well, that doesn't look so caring anymore. So in the same way, our attachment and creating an environment that's caring, that's nurturing, it needs to be always taking in more input about what's happening in the child's life, what's happening in the context, what are the needs, and then in our affect, in our routines, in our programs, whatever it is we're doing, that we build space where we're matching what we see in the children around us, and we're mirroring it, and we're producing that attunement. That's really a great environment where attachment can happen, where healthy connections happen.
Yeah, like we talked about taking the lead from the more long-term caregivers that are there, but as well taking the lead from the children themselves, observing them. Often they know what they need and they know what they don't need.
Exactly.
And so
or at least they're figuring it out.
Yeah, and just like taking them seriously when they communicate, where they're at.
And that's very central to attachment in general, is that we have understood throughout the years that children are designed sometimes with their own set of needs, so it can be some confusing cues, but they have incredible agency. They're able to initiate and encourage the connection that they need. And they're acting out sometimes their misbehavior, their out of control state of, arousal or whatever, is sometimes a siren that's letting us know that's the way they're initiating it. So
they are, there's kind of like a built-in awareness, even if they're not aware, but like they're able to initiate what they need, but maybe just the communication skills aren't developed enough to communicate, with words, with clarity, exactly what they need, but they're reaching out somehow.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would say a resource that's really excellent for this is Dr. Karen Purvis, who's passed away in the last set of years, but she wrote The Connected Child, and she really writes for those who have gone through adoption or foster care, and they're trying to build that healthy attachment with a child who's gone through harm. But actually, it's an excellent resource for anyone building a relationship with a child, any parent, any caregiver. And it really looks at what are some of the nuts and bolts action steps we can take to do connecting behaviors with children and correcting behaviors. We need both. And then what she calls empowering behaviors. And it's really looking at, is the child hungry? Is there something going on today, the environment that we can actually address? That's a great resource.
Yeah. So as people are going on short-term trips and they're, investing in community projects like wells or schools or orphanages or housing, things like that, um, what are some things that people can be doing to make sure that they're, doing more good than harm in
Mhm.
uh, their interactions with people, with adults, with children, just how they kind of show up in that space?
Mm. I think I think one thing is a little bit like deciding that you're going to be a researcher and an investigator
Mm.
and being thoughtful about your own uh, empowering and things in your own. Are you hungry? Are you are you tired? Are
Yeah.
you feeling like are you regulated?
Mm.
And then as you're aware of your own needs, biases,
Mm-hmm.
um, then as you put on your learner hat, your investigator hat, to really pay attention to what you're learning in each moment about something that is valued or something that's motivating kids or parents or the culture around you. I say that because um, there was this conversation I had with some parents while I was living in the Philippines. And I had a woman from South Africa who had raised her kids in Nepal,
Mm.
in Korea, and the Philippines,
Wow.
and South Africa. She had been in 4 different places raising her kids.
Mm.
And then I had a Filipino mom who had just raised her kids there. And then I had a Chinese mom. And I asked them all about how they gave love and received love with their child.
Mm.
And I watched as their answers sometimes were the complete opposite of the other parents. They actually could hardly show, like, hide their shock sometimes. And I was writing down in one column, uh, like, this is like almost like a pros and cons.
Mm.
And I was watching as the one parent would say, well, in our culture, we would never sleep separate from our child. Or the
Mm.
other parent would say, well, we would never stop the child from seeing their grandparent. And then the other, so they were defining these different things. And I called it the FAD principle, filling and depleting domains. And what I saw was, if we're too quick in culture to decide, kind of a bit like that matching smiles
Mm.
when the cues from the child changes, if culturally we walk into a scenario and we say, well, I know without a shadow of a doubt, this always means you care about kids or you love children. And we're forgetting that the very columns that the people around us would actually outline, this is good behavior, this is bad behavior, this is helpful for my child, this is unhelpful for this culture. We might forget to learn some really important things.
Mm.
And what I saw is that every parent I was talking to had a really meaningful attachment with their child, were really safe and secure. They had great attunement with each other, but they were raising their child to know how to live in a specific context and culture.
Right.
And you see, there's a real connection there with being able as short-term missioners to come in and learn about the context, be able to say, yep, I would write the column this way. I would say this fills it, this empties it or depletes it. But I need to pay attention because I might be talking to somebody in a different context who would write it completely different. And they might have really rich relationship with the people they're caring for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. I think there's a bit of a tendency to see something that's other as like
Yes.
not as good, or something that the things that we grew up in, the things that we see as successful in our context, as kind of the way to do something. And that is a really unique perspective to see 3 different moms that are each raising their kids in really beautiful, healthy ways that look so different from one another. And so, yeah, it can be very easy to just kind of copy and paste care into different contexts and assume that that will be received in the same way. But often that's not the case.
Yeah. And I would say, wow, if we aren't careful, we will miss some really beautiful teaching about the way God is loving children, loving families, through different means than what our culture has ever taught us. Because darned if we have things to learn too. So yeah, there's some rich things to be discovered if we go in willing to see it turned on its head.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Some of the staff members here at Hungry for Life, where I was chatting with them, and they were sharing about some experiences that they had where they were in a context where they were just kind of interacting in the way that they felt was, responsible with the children, playing the games, just kind of meeting them at their level, and times when children would voice specific attachments, like say, like, I see you as a mom or a sister and just would like kind of project like a certain kind of bond with one of either the staff members themselves or people on the short-term teams. And so in those contexts, what are some things to kind of watch out for to understand if those kinds of things are happening? And then also what might one do if they find themselves in a situation where the situation has led to the child feeling that kind of bond?
Yes. Yeah, such a good question. I feel like all of us have probably experienced something with a bit of that. And that cross-cultural engagement is so like potent. I mean, it is a little bit like this, the way it can feel to fall in love. I mean, you're really embracing something. But we need to be really prayerful about it. When we look at kids who have experienced poverty and loss, maybe a lot of changes in their lives, a lack of security, they can sometimes have like an inhibited ability to attach. So maybe they just don't connect. They can also have a disinhibited ability to attach. And that would be like the child at the orphanage who actually still didn't know what her name was, but she would want to crawl right into my lap. She didn't know who her parents were. She didn't know how she had ended up there. But she was willing to let all of her boundaries down and connect with me in a way that we would say, in general, not a good idea to crawl into the lap of a stranger. And that kind of vacuum, that desire to find your needs being met in a stranger, I think it's good for us to say, I want to smile, I want to be warm. But just like if I was in my middle years and an adult came to me on the subway and wanted to wrap his arms around me, I might have some caution around boundaries. We need to also have some healthy boundaries around that kind of intimacy and connection, especially when we know that we're going. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think the theme that I'm kind of sensing is that a lot of it has to do with perspective, and the way that the position that we understand that we have in a child's life, and letting that inform behavior. And preparing well.
I think it also actually means esteeming the child even more than you are. Because if you're looking at them and thinking, this person needs me to rescue them, they're letting me know that I am the answer to what they need right now. It's actually a kind of small image of that child or that young person. If in that moment I can fight that urge and say, this is a strong, capable person created in the image of God, and I am one safe person entering into their life, and it means a lot to them right now. It's just a different posture. Do you see what I mean? It's actually more empowering to limit our role and to envision their life being well beyond what we can offer them in that moment.
And understanding the concept that you put forward of the spheres and the circles of, it's not like these children just have kind of one caretaker that's the only one that's, allowed to have positive influence on them. They probably have a few people in their life that come and go and that feel like a safe place when they're there, or drive the car around or bring food or visit, or extended family members. Like, there are people that are kind of in some of the more outer spheres and that can still have a positive influence, kind of like what you were saying about the circles there.
Yeah. And then if I can step back like that, well, now I might think about ways that I can empower other people in their circles. I'm not the hero, but maybe there's somebody there. I could pray for them. I could prayerfully consider supporting financially in a long longevity kind of way in that ministry. Yeah, I could even decide, is there someone here that inspires me to mentor someone who can make an impact when I get back home? Because I've learned something here in this context that's going to change what I do when I get back.
Yeah, it's a really good perspective. So this question kind of comes off the back of that one a little bit, of just like, what are some of the positives actually for short-term teams going in and, having, safe, positive interactions with kids where they feel like when they're in the presence of these visitors that they're safe and respected and they can have fun and they can explore. Like, what are some of the positives there?
Yes. When you really look under the hood of attachment and you actually see what neurons are being firing, what parts of the brain are being lit up and developed in the child's life when they're safe and secure, when they're safe enough to laugh and play, smile, have that mirrored back and forth. I think it's so encouraging to feel like none of this is being wasted. I'm adding a layer, and I'm a part of a bit of this dance for right now, and for however long, in what capacity, fits that specific trip. It's really valuable. And then experimenting with looking at, I might do one type of engagement with that project or those kids in that culture. My teammate might naturally do something altogether different. So going ahead and experimenting with, what's God teaching me about what I bring to this team, and ways that I can build relationship or help behind the scenes, or, whatever dynamic way God wants to use my gifts for that short time. I think it's recognizing that there are really complex needs that we're engaging when we're on these trips. And it needs really dynamic interventions, solutions, multi-layered. So rather than having that discourage us, it can encourage us. I can figure out what piece of the puzzle I have to play at this time. And then, and then that's it. Encourage the other players, the other people in these networks of nurture. We're just one part.
Yeah. And that's a part of Hungry for Life's model as well, is like understanding that when teams are there, or even when the Hungry for Life staff are there, we, our goal is to empower the people that are there long term, so that there can be long-term development and growth in the communities as a whole. And so doing leadership development for the pastors and the community leaders, and ensuring that there can be, jobs that are made, and things that, like projects that feed other projects, so that there can kind of be a circle of community development that then builds on itself.
Yeah.
And so all of these things are definitely in line with Hungry for Life and kind of the strategy with which we approach international missions and sending teams. And it's a big part of why we exist, is to ensure that happens when teams go, that there is responsible interaction with leaders and children and just communities in general, so that there can be long-term health in all of the ways that we're involved in helping. And so, yeah, it's very, very relevant. And I'm so thankful that we were able to have this conversation today and that you were able to share some of your insight. It was really, really beautiful, and just kind of a whole world that a lot of people don't really get to see into. As you mentioned at the beginning, sometimes when the topic of like caring for children comes into the conversation, there's maybe a category of people that feel like, oh, well, that's not really my area of influence. But anyone that's kind of involved in just interacting with others really can grab a hold of some of these things and put them into play in their own life, in their own context, living life here and wherever they live in Western parts of the world, but then as well when we go to different places and interact with people in different contexts, which adds a whole nother layer of complexity and needing to take a back seat and observe the other in a posture of learning and willingness to grow ourselves and our understanding. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, no, my joy and my pleasure. And I'll just end by saying, along that topic of it being relevant for people of all ages.
Yeah.
I like to joke that everything I've learned about this need for self-regulation, for attunement, for identifying what the reaction is, what's tripped people's sense of being threatened or insecure. Wow, those are all skills we can use on our teams with adults who are just grown-up kids who are also having times where they feel insecure, dysregulated, frustrated. And we as a team can be attentive to that for one another as well.
Yeah, totally. Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your thoughts and your perspective. It was really a blessing.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Yes. And thank you so much to all of you who listened. Thank you for listening to another episode of What in the World, and we hope to see you next time.
Thanks for listening to What in the World, where we seek to educate and inspire. Here at Hungry for Life, we are passionate about your group having a global impact in eradicating needless suffering. For more information, head over to our website at hungryforlife.org, and you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and wherever you may listen to podcasts. Tune in every other week for another conversation about what is happening at Hungry for Life.